Games between the world champion Magnus Carlsen and Anish Giri are always of great interest, as the players have a certain rivalry. Anish Giri likes to poke fun at the world champion with some of his little jibes on Twitter, and for the most part Magnus puts up with them but occasionally swats down the young pretender. So that just adds a little bit of spice to their encounters on the chessboard, and in round 8 of the Shamkir tournaments they met. And you're going to see a really exciting game. Giri with the white pieces playing the English, and it turns into a pretty regular kind of opening. In fact it's a reversed Sicilian, and I think this shows that Carlsen is up for a fight in playing this variation with black. Plenty of chances for both sides. Also, I mean, it's pretty theoretical to a certain extent. Let's have a look at that. Here, for example, Castle's kingside is the most popular move here by a long way, but Carlsen plays a5, and I think this is a very clever choice by him. Of course, it's a normal looking move to stop b4, but it's much less popular than Castle's kingside, and Giri, looking at the database, has no experience with this move. Of course, he will have analysed it, but it's not quite the same as playing experience. So everything pretty normal so far. It's basically just a reversed classical dragon. And here white, of course, would like to play moves like knight a4 or knight e4 and put the knight in on c5. That's one particular idea. And knight d5 is a very popular move here, very solid move indeed. Just bringing that knight back into the centre and offering a trade of knights to bring the bishop in the middle. f5 is also a popular move, but Carlsen very quickly played pawn to a4, and this is something of a sideline. Now, this already raises the stakes in the position because black is looking to conquer that b3 square, which, well, that's quite a nice square to have, and also stops white's knight going to a4. Now the only thing is, of course, that pawn can be taken. Can take it straight away like this, but then comes a tactical shot e4. Of course, if that's taken, then queen takes here and rook takes knight. Now white can retreat the knight, but black has very good compensation. Giri played instead in this position after a4. He first played knight d2. Now he thought for about 6.5 minutes over that move, so that shows he wasn't quite as familiar with this variation as Magnus was. And here, well, this is still being played before, not in many games. And if black wants a very solid continuation, then once again knight d5 is a good move. Just trading bishops here, and I don't think there's much wrong with black's position at all, but Magnus clearly up for a fight. He played f5, and this forces the position. In fact, it has been seen before, and I'm sure this was part of Magnus's preparation. So sometimes you can force through f4, sometimes even e4. The pressure is on white. So at this moment, Giri exchanged on b6 after 13 minutes thought, and then knight takes a4. Now Giri knew that he was following a game between Nepomniachtchi and Aronian that was played last year in Geneva. And the game went exactly like this, and of course Carlsen knew this too. It's interesting, sometimes he avoids theory altogether. Sometimes he's happy to play into it. It's clear that he would have looked to this variation. And Giri now thought for half an hour. So it's clear he was really less familiar with this variation than Carlsen, and it showed. After bishop g5, there's a threat to take here and take off the knight. So the knight came back. That's after half an hour's thought. But, I mean, a fairly obvious move, but Giri had to acclimatise himself to this position. I think that's sensible. And then e4. So you can see that for a pawn, black has pretty decent compensation in the shape of the two bishops, and of course there's pressure here. So yeah, very interesting compensation actually. I think Magnus would have been pretty pleased with the outcome of the opening. And here that game I mentioned between Nepomniachtchi and Aronian continued. Rook b1, stepping out of this pin, and well, Aronian now played knight e5 and knight g4, and an absolutely crazy game after bishop e3, which Nepomniachtchi won, but well, it was pretty mad. You don't have to play in such an aggressive way. For example, rook f7 is possible here. I mean, who knows? Maybe Magnus had prepared this. Rook f7 with the idea of rook d7, or indeed simply queen d7 here as well. But after e4, back to the game, Giri played king h1. And I think his intention must have been to give this pawn here, but that would allow white to get a foothold in the middle of the board like this. And well, after this trade, things I don't think are bad at all for white. That with the pawn on f4, that really shuts out black's pieces. But Carlsen, after well 8.5 minutes thought, played queen d7. It's much more enterprising. So he's clearly up for a fight. Well, when isn't he? And in this position, Giri nudged the rook out of the way. My computer suggests g4. Now, that is a most un-Giri-like move. And I would say, well, a very inhuman move altogether. After that, the position just explodes. I mean, you could say it's a very principled move to try and undermine the pawn on e4. However, it is utterly bonkers. But I thought I'd mention it because it just shows sometimes, I mean, could well be objectively a good move, but can you imagine any human in their right mind playing g4? Anyway, rook b1, rook d8. So I think Carlsen would be very pleased with this position. Pawn down, but fantastic compensation. Pressure on the d file. His bishop's looking good. And white's pieces, well, you can see, very restricted. Time to bring a knight out. Now, Carlsen doesn't bother taking anything, just queen f7, more pressure here, and soon on the f-file as well. b3, and now Carlsen took on d3 and advanced with f4. So this is, I mean, classic Sicilian play, really. To use the f-file, and sometimes that pawn is going to trade here and sometimes it's going to push all the way. Of course, f3 is already a threat, winning a piece. And if that bishop moves out of the way, it's a bit risky, isn't it? Maybe bishop h3 looks somehow a bit dubious for white. So knight e4 played, hitting the bishop, and the bishop came back. And now again, white has this dilemma. Do you leave this pawn here and allow this pawn to advance? You know, you could consider playing rook e1, but do you want to take this away from the f-file? And should you be allowing f3? It's very risky. So Giri played, in some ways, a very ugly move, damaging his pawn structure, but actually in some ways a very practical move. And in fact, Carlsen said after the game that he thought this was more ugly than bad. It looks horrible. White's pawns are split here. Look at these isolated pawns. But it's probably not that bad for white, because these knights at least have good outposts. They can't be driven away. Nevertheless, I think a much more attractive position for black to play than white. Knight b4, good move. Hitting the pawn here. But queen e2 is a decent defence, because if knight takes d3, then knight, well, first of all, rook here, pushing the knight away, and then knight g5. And that will allow white to grab one of these bishops. So Carlsen sensibly doesn't take the first pawn on offer, but withdraws the queen. Now that prepares a couple of things. Potentially an attack on the h-file, but it vacates the f4 square. Maybe for a rook, maybe for that knight. Let's see. Rook d1, defending the pawn, and knight d5, perhaps preparing to spin the knight into f4. Rook g1. And here I was surprised at Carlsen's move. He plays very practically sometimes maybe too practically. He played king h8. Of course, it's a very decent move. I was expecting just rook f4 straight away to go straight on the attack. And to be honest, it'll be similar to the game continuation, but I just thought it seemed to have a bit more urgency about it. But it's very cool. He just played king h8. By the way, if knight f4, then queen e3 holds things together. So anyway, king h8 played by Carlsen. And now he played rook f4. Knight into e5. So Giri is finding his feet here. Those knights look pretty good in the middle of the board. And of course, this is not the most beautiful move to play. That bishop on f1 has now been humbled. It doesn't really have a very good perspective considering the pawns are on d3 and f3. Nevertheless, those knights don't look bad. So this is still a very tricky position. Black obviously has very nice compensation for the pawn, but it's still pretty unclear. Now the knight came into f4, hitting the queen. f3, of course, necessary to defend that pawn on h2. And now Carlsen took on b3. And now Giri very, very quickly played rook b1, which looks like the most natural move. The rook is attacked and you want to aim at those doubled pawns as well. My computer suggests rook c1 and still thinks that white is okay here. Now, it could well be. But rook coming to c1 just looks for counterplay down here at some moment. And, well, possibly even pegs back the rook on f8 as well, considering the weakness of the back rank. But anyway, it's still a very unclear position. But after rook b1, in fact, well, things turned out well for black. Bishop c4 seems to keep more tension in the position and looks like the best move. Bishop b5 played by Giri, and now things definitely turn in black's favour after queen e6. This is a really nice centralisation, keeping some control over d5, and this queen is beautifully centralised now. I suppose one thing about putting the queen in the middle of the board is that it prevents white's queen from occupying, let's say, a good diagonal here. And now, well, let's count the pawns. After that little transaction, black is now a pawn up. And, well, Giri, after the game, said he was still pretty optimistic here. He thought that things had started to balance out over the last few moves. But, well, as Carlsen said, he felt that he was still in the driving seat here because he couldn't see exactly how white could improve his position. But he could see how he could improve his position with moves such as bishop d8 round to c7 to put some pressure through the knight down to h2. And added to that, Carlsen still had plenty of time on the clock, but Giri was down to something like, I think 5 or 6 minutes for the rest of his moves to get to the time control. whereas Carlsen had something like half an hour. But it's still tricky. You can see those knights flying into the position, but Carlsen held his nerve. He did very well. He didn't chop that knight off. He played instead Queen e8, and that just holds everything together. That bishop doing a very good job. And the queen also looking at the rook, which is still tricky. In this position, for example, if the knight goes back, then rook takes is very strong. If king h2, then it's going to be checkmate, like that. And if queen takes rook, then you can see that you can take that loose rook on d5. Now it's a very tricky position after queen e8. d5 is kind of the obvious move to try and stir things up. Giri said he didn't trust it because it loosened the knight on e5. He felt his position was altogether very loose. And actually his judgment was correct, but it's quite tricky. If bishop f6, in fact d6, and things are starting to look very dangerous for white. But in fact rook h5 is an excellent move. So hitting this knight and looking through to the knight on e5. And here, well, knight e6 looks very tricky, because if knight takes, then if queen takes pawn, then knight g6 with a discovered attack, and rook takes, that can't be taken because of queen g7. But in this position, after knight e6, black has a very cool move, just bishop f6. And if knight takes knight, then bishop takes e5. Well, basically the complications work out in black's favour. Very tricky to work that out, but interesting that Giri didn't trust it. I'm sure Magnus would have found the right continuation. He did have enough time. So in this position, Giri just retreated the rook, but after this, it all goes wrong. This is the right moment to trade. You can see the knight hits the rook and hits that loose pawn here. And, well, once again, it's the story of whose king is better. Position is starting to open up, and black's king is very safe. White's king certainly isn't. And black's piece is very well coordinated. And after this, again, an excellent move by Carlsen. I think this phase of the game he played superbly. Queen comes to d8, just looking at the d4 pawn, but also with some kind of threat to move to d5, checking the king. And you can see in this position, well, with that pawn on g4 exposing the king, this is actually just lost for white. Best continuation here is to trade rooks. But after this, white is still a pawn down, but it's not really that. That pawn will come good eventually, but it's the fact that here black's king is going to be completely safe on h7, whereas white's king is dreadfully placed. So let's just play this very coolly. This is a Carlsen type position. The queen dominates in the center, the king is safe, the knight will come into f4, and you can see the pawns are loose, the king is loose as well. It's a winning position for black. But instead of that, Giri actually lost immediately. He played rook h3 and Carlsen found the win. Queen d5, queen e4, and now the threats are just unstoppable. Of course, the queen is about to bounce down to the back rank and the knight will come in as well. Queen b4 stops that and looks at the rook, but a cool move from Carlsen, rook f6. And here Giri resigned. White has no sensible move in this position. Well, for example, let's play if rook d3, trying to bring that rook back to reality, knight f4, and it's absolutely hopeless. Or rook a3, Don't forget about that. Then simply h6 and king here. And white has no defense to the attack with queen, rook, and the knight coming into either d4 or f4. It's just completely over. Well, I think a really convincing win from Carlsen. Everything went right. Perfect opening preparation, getting just the kind of position he wanted, something unbalanced. And Giri just never quite found his feet. That victory leaves Magnus at the top of the tournament table in Shamkir after 8 rounds. So just 1 round to go. Ding Liren won today, so that leaves Carlsen and Ding at the top. Carlsen has 5.5, Ding has 5, and they play against each other in the final round. Watch out for that. Thanks for watching.